One of my principles in dealing with resistance to change is, yes, there is going to be some level of resistance. People will be negatively affected by the change. People might not trust you. People might not understand it. There could be a lot of reasons why that will occur. And there's a normal level of resistance for every change that you would imagine, the requisite level. I want leaders not to make it worse.
Welcome to the Inner Game of Change podcast, uncovering the layers of complexity of organizational change with some of the bright minds in the field. I am Ali Juma, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast. Today I'm privileged to be joined by Dr. David Weiss, a renowned author, speaker, and executive coach. Dr. Weiss is the president and CEO of Weiss International, where he has led over 1,000 business and organizational projects across 5 continents. He's a recognized expert in innovation, leadership, and HR consulting, with accolades from global organizations including the Government of Canada and the Asia Pacific HR Congress. In his latest article, Winning Against Resistance to Change, Dr. Weiss shares powerful strategies for navigating and overcoming resistance to change. Let's dive into these insights with Dr. Weiss and learn how to lead more effectively through challenging transitions. I am grateful to have David chatting with me today. David, thank you so much for joining me in the Inner Game of Change podcast. I am eternally grateful for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you so much. David, today we want to talk about your great article around change resistance, why resistance happens. Would you like to share with me what prompted you to write about this particular topic?
The article is called Winning Against Resistance to Change, and I've been dealing with change all my career. The consulting world is all about change. If there's no change, then there's no need for assistance. My world, I'm a Ph.D. psychologist. And as a psychologist, it's all about change and choice. So it's part of everything that we do. We find that there's a lot of models about change. I wrote about it in one of my earlier books, High Impact HR, and then Innovative Intelligence. But there's not enough written about resistance specifically. People touch on it, but they don't dive into it. And what I decided to do was to, based upon all my research and everything I've done, articulate 8 principles associated with resistance to change to guide leaders, to guide practitioners, to guide consultants, to guide academics, to start thinking through what they might do to address resistance in organizations to change, and in fact, how to ultimately implement change successfully.
David, in your article, you're already making that, right assumption that whether you like it or not, resistance will happen in the workplace. And that's a normal, natural reaction towards anything new coming our way. In fact, I also was thinking the other day, any new government gets voted on the promise of changing things. And before even you get voted, you will see the resistance already happening. So the premise is that it will happen. Your article is about offering the insight and the tools for leaders to really understand it before they decide to label people bad or good, towing the line or not.
Right. One of the characteristics of change that's very important is that I position change not as what we were doing before was wrong, and therefore now we need to do it correctly, or what was bad and now it's good. But when I instruct people on how to discuss change, I advise them to think of it as the fit. And it's the fit between what is the current context that you're facing and how are you handling that based upon the way you've always done things in the past. And at one point, what we did in the past was probably a good fit for that context. But now that the context has changed, we're in a post-COVID environment, the technology has radically changed, competition has changed, the user, the experience of the customer is radically different, their knowledge base about what they're doing. There's so many changes. The question is the way that we were operating in the past going to be a good fit in this new context. So we need to change the language. One of my principles in dealing with resistance to change is, yes, there is going to be some level of resistance. People will be negatively affected by the change. People might not trust you. People might not understand it. There could be a lot of reasons why that will occur. And there's a normal level of resistance for every change that you would imagine, the requisite level. I want leaders not to make it worse, not to make the mistake of going in there and saying, you did it wrong and now do it right. And all you did was you alienated more people, or said, the way we always did it was something that I can't believe we do it that way. And all that kind of rhetoric is a leader actually creating more resistance than really should be, and bringing the resistance back to the requisite level of resistance for the change is the first place of where to start. So get really good at knowing how to communicate change so that the resistance you get is because the change generates some level of reaction from some people who will respond in that manner.
So, David, what I hear you say is that the way leaders react to resistance can make it better or worse. Is that what it is?
It's not the reaction to the change that I'm describing. What I'm describing is the way the leader introduces the change, the way the leader perceives the change. So if the leader is coming in and saying that the way we have done it has been wrong and therefore we need to do it this way, just by virtue of positioning it that way, you're going to create more resistance than should have been there if you were to use different language. Like, what we are doing now in this new context doesn't fit as well. And we found a different alternative that we think fits better. It's a different question than saying wrong and right. One thing I've often told people is in communicating change that they're surprised at is, how do you actually honor the past? It's not about the past was bad and now it's good, but leaders need to know how to say, what we've done before was important and it worked and it fit that environment. And I want to honor that. I want to hear those stories. I don't want to discard and discount those people, but I want to actually embrace them. And by virtue of doing that, you'll win over a few more that you might have lost by virtue of coming in and speaking from a perspective of the way you've always done it is wrong, and now I know how to do it correctly. So I'm concerned about the leader actually being the generator of unnecessary resistance.
I like that. Part of your role as a leader is not to create more heat on top of the change.
Right.
You focus a lot in the article on the bystanders. Do you want to double click on that, please?
Well, so the proposition is that the champion, the one who's going to be passionately for your change, they believe in it, they're going to probably be vocal about support, and they will be out there saying it to others. If you think about what a resistor is, they tend to be vocal, but instead of being positive towards your change, they're negative. So the proposition is that a resistor really is a champion for the other side. They don't call themselves resistors. They call themselves champions for the other side. If you think about an election, it's the people who are advocates for your opponent. And the probability of changing the mind of a resistor or someone who's a advocate for the other side is probably equal to the probability of changing the mind of a champion. So what are we doing? We work and spend all this time thinking about the resistors and trying to change their mind, but the probability of succeeding is exceedingly low. It's not impossible. It could be very beneficial if you succeeded it, but it's probably low. I kind of think of it like penny stocks. If I got one that made a lot of money, that's great. But the reality is it's unlikely. So where should you be focusing your attention? And usually the majority of people in any significant change haven't really taken a position. They sit on the fence. I call them bystanders. And what I mean by a bystander is they're waiting and seeing. And who's actually talking to the bystander? Well, usually it's the resistors who are talking to them and saying, this is why you should join my side and actually resist a little bit more. And you as the leader are spending all your time trying to convince the resistor, who is basically immovable because they're the champions for the other side. So you leave the field totally open to influence the bystanders. And the proposition is, and a very important one of the principles, is focus on the bystanders as your priority. If they are representing over 50% of a population in any significant change, they're the wait and see people, then you need to actually talk to them, share with them, honor their past, share the why of what's needed, share, what you're doing and why you think it's a better fit, engage them so that they feel a part of the change. And by virtue of doing that, you might win over half of them to say, you know what, I'll help. I'll go along. I won't be your champion, but I'll help. And the other half will say, I'll still be a bystander, but you will not be in a position where you'll have so many joining the resistor because no one was talking to them. So focus on the bystanders, probably a major insight that a lot of people miss when they think about resistance. It's like the teacher who teaches the class and focuses on the two students who are making the most noise in the class. And the parents come to the teacher and say, there are 30 kids in this class. What about the other 28? Aren't you teaching them as well? You're focusing on just the two noisy ones. And that's a mistake that leaders make frequently. And in fact, I talk to executives. They make it at the very top of the organization. They worry about the noisiest person. They're the hardest ones to change. And they don't spend enough time on those bystanders who are really going to make the difference in building the critical mass to support the change.
David, I want to ask you a question. How can somebody become a bystander? Is that because the messages are not clear? Is that because they don't understand the particulars of the change? Is that because we've got a tendency to wait and see and which direction the change will happen? Maybe is there a tendency for the bystanders to listen to the resistors first and see, because the resistors usually create the story? Why would I become a bystander? Why would I not choose a stance early?
It's our political undecided vote. Why are people undecided? Why do people not make a choice? We know in marketing that there are many people who are those who wait and see. There are early adopts, there are late adopts, and people don't necessarily trust. They don't necessarily jump immediately. But remember, the bystanders are not resisting. The bystanders are just watching. They're checking it out. They're trying to see what is happening. So it's very common. In fact, a lot of people who end up becoming helpers, they end up, originally starting as bystanders. It's not a bad thing, the bystanders. The bystanders are a normal reaction to see what's the implications. And some of the implications that people are thinking about is this going to hurt me? Is it not going to hurt me? I don't know yet. I'll wait and see. Do I trust you? Do I not trust you? I'm not sure. I'm going to wait and see. Do I really understand it? Like, what is the change? Why are we changing? Why are you messing up everything? I don't really get it. So I don't get it until I understand it. Then ultimately I'll be a bystander. That's why I propose that you use what I call the 5 stories of change, and it's focus them especially on bystanders. Story number 1 is honor the past, which I referred to earlier. Story number 2 is understand the new why, the new context, what's really going on that actually necessitates a potentially different response. Story number 3 is what is deficient about the current way we are doing things that doesn't fit the new context. Story number 4 is what are we proposing that ultimately is a better fit? And at the same time, what are we not changing? That often is very important for the bystander because they'll exaggerate and they'll say, oh, it's bigger than I thought it was, but narrow it to what really is changing. And story number 5 is how can the bystander actually put their fingerprints and contribute to the change? And by virtue of being part of the change, people start saying, you know what, I'll help out the process. People don't mind change. They mind being changed. If we can change the dynamic so that people feel that they're meaningfully contributing to the change, then it creates an environment where more than likely they'll say, I'll give it a try. And that's all you really want from the bystander. You want them to move up one notch, not to be the champions, although that'd be wonderful, but at least to say, I'll be a helper. I'll actually go along when you ask me to do it, and I'll participate in it, and certainly won't resist. So the bystanders are crucial, and it's a very normal reaction. It's not that, it's not anything other than people not understanding they need the leader to focus on them so that they can journey with you on this change process.
And this is how I read in your article. This is the best way to create and focus on the critical mass.
Right. So the idea of the critical mass is, just think of an election again.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to ever get 100% of the vote that's going to support you. If you're in the public sector and you launch a new change, you're always going to have people who are unhappy with that new policy, with that new change that occurred. If you're in a private sector environment, you're implementing a significant change or restructuring or whatever, there's always going to be some people who are not going to be happy with it. And then there'll be that large group that's going to be in the middle. You want to implement change with the least amount of friction, where the change is going to be smooth. You're going to need a majority of people who are at least helpers and at least champions. So if we think about it, I wrote about in the article, Winning Against Resistance to Change, that, if we think about, let's say of 100 people, 10% are champions and 10% are resistors. The remaining 80% tends to be 20% are helpers when you launch change, but the big group, 60%, are going to be the bystanders. So we need to get about half of those bystanders to become helpers. And then all of a sudden we have about 60% or so that are saying, I'll help you out, still with 30% bystanders. And if you have the majority of people, the tipping point has occurred, and people will go along just because everybody's moving in that direction. So that's what I mean by critical mass. Give up on the idea that you'll get 100% approval. It's not going to occur. But it doesn't mean that you're going to ignore the resistors, because if you can win a resistor over, it could be very, very helpful. So I want you to also, once you focus on the bystanders, have individual conversations with the key resistors to find out, why are they resisting? People whitewash the resistor and say all resistance is alike, but that's not correct. Resistance could differ. For example, someone might be resistant because they disagree with you. I call that principled resistance. And principled resistance means that, I don't agree that there's a compelling reason to change. I don't agree that your choice of what to do is the correct thing. And maybe in conversation, they'll understand some variables that might make them realize, oh, I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that. Now I can support you. The other one is cultural resistance, probably the toughest to move, where I don't trust you. And trust, when you fall out of trust, takes forever to build, and it's very, very difficult to reconstruct trust. So if they don't trust you or trust the organization, they have bad experiences with change. They thought you said before that things won't hurt anybody, but it did. They're not going to easily trust you again. Find out if that's the compelling reason. That's going to be a very tough group to change. And then often the largest group of resistors are the ones where they understand it, they even trust you, but in the end, they feel that, it's not good for me. I have to learn something new I don't want to learn. It changes my job. I lose my job. Whatever the case is, it's going to hurt me. What's in it for me? The WIFM, as we call it, WIFM. What's in it for me? And those people, you could talk to them. It's going to be tough to change if you can't accommodate them, but maybe you can accommodate them. Maybe the resistance is, this is a really tough time in my life. I'm having a child. My mother is sick. I've got just too much going on. I can't handle another change at this moment. Is there a way to accommodate that timing variable? And there may be, if you understand it. So talk to that resistor, find out whether it's personal, whether it's cultural, whether it's principled, and through that process, see if you can work something out that might get them to move. That could be very, very beneficial. But the number one focus needs to be on the bystander. That's the secondary choice, to go back to the resistor and see if you can make any movement.
The reason why I think some of us do focus on the resistors, first of all, they're very loud. They already have influence in their teams. And it's a natural thing for us to look for the negativity. We would like the world to be perfect when we introduce a change. And also sometimes my observation, David, is that leaders are genuinely interested in trying to win the resistors. But my counsel to them is that do your due diligence, follow your responsibilities, do the best. But if the best is not going to cut it, you're going to have to move. And you're going to have to make some big calls on that. As long as I call it the deal from the organization. So what I call it an employee change empathy is when the employee will say, I will pay attention, I'll try to understand the particulars of the change. I will have an opportunity to ask all the questions. But there's an organizational change empathy, which is the organization it's like their deal is saying, when I'm going to introduce a change, rest assured I will follow a process. And it's a fair process to train everybody, to support you, to be very upfront about the impacts and what's in it for you. All of that. If those two things do not work, then we'll have the friction in the middle. Is that your observation as well?
That's very astute of you. Absolutely. But there is one other element which I ask the listeners to think about, and that is, how can you find a way, whenever you're implementing change, to give those who are going to experience the change, if possible, some space where they can influence the change, where they can have some way of expressing a thought in an area that you want input. So, for example, one organization I was working with developed a 3-year plan of what they wanted to do. And we took the next level of management together, and we had them define what do we need to do in the first year to actually launch this plan to go forward into the third. All of a sudden, that 50 people who are in that next level became part of the change. And even though we weren't asking them to change or input into what we're going to do in 3 years, we said that was defined already. By virtue of having the opportunity to contribute to the first year, they felt a part of it and it changed the dynamic. In another group, which was more junior in the organization, we actually talked about different communications of how it could be communicated to various stakeholders. How would you vary the way that we would talk about how it's actually going to influence them? Because you have the voice of those customers more closely near your ear. Maybe you would be able to give us insights and teach us what we should do in order to bring this change out to our customers, because sometimes it affects customers. So again, by virtue of saying we honor you by wanting your opinion, but in an authentic way, not we asking your opinion because we hope you'll come up with our answers already, but rather we truly want to know. And if you can find a way to do that, it will radically change the experience of those who are going through change, from being individuals who feel like they're victims to people who are at cause, where they actually are part of the change and creating it. And not all of them, but for a number of them, that will be sufficient to give them the motivation to really support the change.
Two things that I want to comment on: that genuine interest in somebody's contribution to the change is really important. As he mentioned, we should not just be looking for the answers that we've already sort of got in our heads. And sometimes we try to prove those propositions that we already established the business case on. And unfortunately, the business case happens before the contribution. That is the complexity sometimes where it happens. I want to shift gear and I want to ask you about, an organization is always introducing new changes. I mean, the way I look at it, a leader's job is really to make decisions, and those decisions become changes, and those changes get implemented. So really, in essence, the leader is a change maker in the first place. My observation is that the problem for many leaders, and especially middle managers, is that they think that one change introduced and produced a lot of resistance, and therefore that's the way things will be. And I often realize that an introduction of change A may give you certain responses and behaviors responses from your audience and from your employees. But maybe 3-6 months later, you introduce a change and it's a completely different set of resistors, different set of bystanders, and different set of champions. The way we look at the change and who is introducing the change always colors the way we respond to it. Am I close to accurate in here?
As with all things, it's not an either or, it's an and also.
Sure.
It's kind of the principle of innovation that I wrote about in one of my books, Innovative Intelligence. The principle is that there are going to be people who are culturally resistant, which means that they have internalized a belief about leadership and the organization that they're not trustworthy. And as a result, if you introduce even a simple change, they'll say, I don't trust you. And it's deep and it's not going to move. But we need to diagnose resistance, because there is a whole other group of people who are resistant to change because it personally affects me in this change, but another change, it doesn't. So I'll respond very differently. Or in this change, it affects me where I love it, so I'll be the champion. But in this other one, it affects me negatively, so I might be a resistor. So you might get that. Or in fact, in one change, I might really get it. I understand it. I kind of think it makes a lot of sense, and I'll be very supportive of it. While in another, I don't understand it. So I'm going to be a bystander and wait and see. So you'll find the cultural resistance is much more enduring and carries over from change to change because it's about trust. But the personal resistance and the principle-based resistance, those two are usually variables that will change based upon the change that you're introducing. So that's why I said it's an and also. There are some cases where, yes, it will carry over. And that's probably why people believe it, because there was carryover. There's evidence. But the evidence isn't for everybody. And they need to be better at segregating and saying there are some kinds of resistance like this and some like that, and don't generalize to say everybody's like those cultural resistant individuals.
Where would you mostly see the highest level of resistance? Is it certainly not in the early stages? I mean, you'll see some loud voices in there. But my observation, David, is it usually happens just when we start training people and then asking people to change their ways of working based on the new change. And all of a sudden, you might have had a number of bystanders, but these people immediately realize or pay more attention to the change, and they realize that actually this is not what I was expecting.
That's very, very interesting observation. And there is a much larger proportion of what looks like resistance when a new change is launched. And the reason why is a normal human emotional reaction of responding with some level of shock. I can't believe you're doing that. I'm hearing this thing. They become, and that kind of early stage resistance is something which usually settles. It's like the storm, and then all of a sudden the storm quiets down and you see the damage. That will settle in a week, in 2 weeks. Listen a lot, pay attention, and it'll settle. So don't panic at the early stages at that point. You're describing, maybe they were going along, and now it's becoming real. And now you're going to get a new level of resistance. Oh, you're really doing this. And you're going to get a certain kind of increase of the resistance that might occur. And that certainly can happen. It certainly does. There's a pattern. It's called the approach avoidance theory. And the way it works is that the further away, you kind of look at a curve and you say, the further away my approach towards something, my emotional commitment to approaching it is much higher than my avoidance. But then as I get closer and closer to the actual moment where it's going to happen, often the avoidance starts going, it crosses over the approach. And, oh no, it's really going to happen. And now it's as if I'm experiencing it for the first time again. So we call that the approach avoidance theory. When you're further away, approach is stronger than avoidance. But as you get closer and closer to the critical moment, the avoidance starts becoming more powerful than the approach. And it's not at all surprising that you might get a peak again, where people will start saying, I can't believe we're doing this. I thought it would go away.
Yes.
I thought you'd get promoted by this time, and so it could happen, and again, just, listen closely. It likely will settle a little bit more. So it's like an early shock reaction that's reoccurring, and pay close attention to those very quiet people. One of the mistakes that the leaders make is they assume that if you're quiet, you're probably willing to help, because helpers and bystanders look alike. They're both quiet, but helpers will help. Bystanders will wait and see, but they look alike. So you assume that they'll probably help. I'll focus on the noisy ones. Think the opposite way. Think that if you're quiet, you're probably a bystander. I need to check out if you're one of the helpers, because that's a smaller population within that. So, it will settle down, even if it's at approach avoidance when it occurs. But, it's a very good observation that it might happen several times in a change process. It's not going to necessarily be once and done. The first time experience of that shock might occur multiple times.
I've got another observation, and I really like that. The further the change, the more inclined we might not wholeheartedly welcome it, but certainly we're not going to oppose it. I've got a different observation, is that apathy happens when it's a metaphor that I usually use. The lion is so far away, we've heard in the news that there's a lion in the country, but we don't care. And then next thing we hear is that the lion is actually in the next village. We got our apathy more alarmed now. And then next thing we hear is that we can hear the lion from a distance. And the closer, and then all of a sudden we realize the lion is actually real and in our village. And that's when we start thinking critically about it. I think the smart, savvy employees, in my mind, become good change managers. They see the change, and then they can ask all the smart questions about the change. I always encourage people that this is going to impact the way you're probably going to work. You're going to impact the systems, your rhythm. So it's your best interest to ask me all the questions about it, and ask me how I'm going to support you, and ask me how I'm going to train you, and ask me if you step up, will you be okay? Will you be safe in there? And I call that the employee would need to take control of that. This change is coming, and therefore I need to know everything about it. That's what I call a savvy employee in today's world anyway.
It's actually not easy to see and react to the lion when it's really far away.
Yes, yeah.
But if you think about what's the expectation of line of sight, of how far you can see into the future, time horizon. One way to think about organizational hierarchy is to think about how far you are expected to see into the future. So if I'm a president, I should be thinking 3 to 5 years out. And I should be seeing that lion coming not only in the next village, but in the next country. And I can be able to forecast it and think about it and ultimately be planning for it, because it takes a long time to get there. And maybe the middle management, they're thinking 1 to 3 years out. And if I'm on the front line, I'm thinking maybe 1 to 3 months. So if we're expecting people to really see that far in advance, they just don't have that vista. They don't have that experience. And so they're going to need to see it when it's more evident, and they won't experience it. They'll just sit and say, it's just too far away. I've experienced a lot of change where people make the mistake at senior levels where they communicate too early. Good change with bad timing is bad change. You need good timing. When is the right moment when you should introduce people to the change where they can actually at least feel the lion in your metaphor? And if I do it too early, they're going to get exhausted. It might take 2 years for the change to occur, and they're waiting and waiting, and then they say, forget it. I'm not even going to think about it anymore. And then they'll be shocked when it really occurs. So maybe you need to wait a little bit and hold it back and see if in fact it's really going to occur, and until it becomes a reality. And when it becomes a reality that can be felt to some extent, maybe that's the time that your timing would be better to share it. It's an elegant moment of change when you're a leader. It's how close to the change should I communicate it where it doesn't create unnecessary anxiety, and at the same time, people don't feel like you should have talked to me earlier and I might have been able to give you some advice. So it's that exact moment where the brilliant change leaders are excellent at that. And when they get really good at that, that has a tremendous impact on reducing resistance in the organization because they trust you. You're sharing with them at the right time. They're able to input, and ultimately they're protected from your lion, or at least know what's going to be done about it.
One of my guests in one of the podcasts made a statement which I really admire and then changed the way I think about that. She said, Edwina Pike, she said, change happens at the speed of trust.
Interesting.
And it's the more you think about it, so you mentioned the word trust multiple times now, and I really like that. I also like how you position that delicate moment when you introduce the change and you create. Your underlying message is actually look at the context right. Of the change. Look at the in the sport they call it the playing conditions. What are the playing conditions when you introduce the change? Knowing there are no perfect moments, because sometimes you need to introduce the change, but that doesn't mean they ignore, paying attention to those things, because they can enable or disable your efforts in the change.
One of the things that's very important in the process of change is, people are looking for models. They see the Cotter model, they see my model, they see others' models, and there are some, and they're all good. They all converge. They all have goodness. And the assumption is that if you follow a model, it will work. But the reality is change is not linear. Change is complex. I've written about the difference between complexity and complicated situations and how you make decisions in different situations. Complexity means that the degree of understanding may be variable or low, or the degree of certainty of what to do may be low. So by definition, all change has uncertainties. All change has issues that maybe we don't understand all the variables. So it's complex. So as much as we create models, all those models are guideposts to give you an idea from which you should vary. But as you said, we need to look at the context, look at the playing field. It's the reality you are in that moment, and make some choices in that context that will ultimately help you choose what to do. It's not a cookie cutter approach. If I follow step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, it will be perfect. It increases the probability. It's all a probability game. There's no guarantees in change because it's complex, and you're dealing with human beings and you're dealing with emotions, which is a beautiful thing, but not predictable in the same way as if I need to fix a machine. If I have a machine that's broken, I can figure out what's wrong. I can diagnose the machine. I can fix the part, and then ultimately I can replace the part and I can put the machine back in action. I don't have to deal with any emotion. Ultimately, I can do it. With human beings, that's not the way it works. We have to be knowing the playing field in your terms, and ultimately be ready to deal with the complexities of what you're facing every time you implement a change.
How do employees vent their resistance? So some of them will be vocal. And I've noticed a lot of organizations when they put, those engagement surveys and pulse checks and all of those, not many of them have questions about how we manage change in the workplace. They're predominantly performance focused. What's your take on that?
That's interesting. That's a very, very interesting observation. I think you're correct that they aren't doing that. I've been a proponent of, getting rid of, these lengthy engagement surveys every year or 2 years, and instead going with rapid, what they call pulse surveys, and even using sampling theory. So if I have 5,000 people in my organization, why do I need to survey 5,000 people every time? What if I surveyed 500 and I surveyed them every month? And so I get to all 5,000 in a year. Would that give me sufficient information to know what's going on? And if I included in that, how did we handle that change? How did we handle another one? Or can we have, there's some organizations that actually do a survey every day. Every time you connect onto your computer, there's a question for the day that you answer. So there's ways of making it alive, and we should be leveraging those kinds of things. But I think you're absolutely right. There are not sufficient opportunities to ask about the change, and we need to be doing that a lot more. It's an opportunity area for people to learn of how people are responding to the change, and the more they can use it through surveys or discussions, it makes a massive difference. One thing we found, which is a really interesting pattern, is now I'm talking to the senior executives out there in the listener of this community. Often I find that the president or the senior member of the team of the executives, who may be 3 or 4 levels above the people who are going to experience the change, they seem to believe they should be the voice and announce the change to everybody. Now, we did some research at Queen's University, and we found that in fact is a low probability of success. And the reason why is if the top person, the CEO, announces a change, then what will occur is people will hear it and then very quickly gloss over because they'll be overwhelmed by it. They can't ask questions. They'll be scared. They won't hear it. And what we found is that the better choice is have the person that has that high trust, someone closer, maybe your direct manager, be the one that shares what the change is going to be, so you can ask questions, dialogue, and then use the CEO not as the initiator announcing the change, but use the CEO as the validator, as the second repeat without being repetitive for the audience. And then when they hear it the second time, they'll say, oh, yes, that's consistent with what I heard already, and they'll listen to it. So, there are mistakes that are being made. Going back to my initial point, leaders really need to clean up the way that they introduce, launch, communicate, and engage with people when they introduce change so that they don't create more resistance than ultimately should be there by nature of what that change is.
I like that, David. I really like that. And now you make me think the reason probably why we don't get moved by, the grand statements from the executive is because they are usually so far away, detached from the actual world. The second thing, they're a bit esoteric in many ways. They talk about principles and vision and direction. And for me, I just want to manage my tasks for the day. And so the middle managers and the direct leaders probably have better chance. And then I like your approach around asking the senior leaders to support the messages rather than initiate them themselves.
Right.
I am aware of the time. We are coming close to the end of the podcast. These are a question that I usually ask my guests, David. What would be your counsel, and based on your experience and insight, and you've worked with a lot of change managers and you've come across a lot, what would be your counsel and advice to us people in the business of change and communication when it comes to resistance? What could be some of the things that we need to rethink based on your insight?
There are several that we pointed out. So if we could summarize it, number one, focusing on the resistors has a relatively low probability of success. Think about resistors as champions for the other side, and therefore focus on those quieter people who I would refer to as bystanders. We talked about that particular insight, which I have shared numerous times, and consistently sophisticated leaders find it insightful. And that, they didn't think of that. They think that if they're quiet, they probably will help. They don't think about it. And, even to the point where, make a list of all the people and did you get to everybody? Check them off and make sure there is no one that you missed, because sometimes it's that quiet one that you wouldn't really go after, but, find a way to talk to everybody. Even when I do strategy and we, let's say a smaller organization of 100 people and we're working with 10 people in a strategy team, I would ask the 10 people to each identify 9 people they're willing to talk to on an ongoing basis as we develop strategy to keep getting their input. So you're almost like doing a constant survey throughout. So by the time you're done and you're going to implement this change to those 100 people, they're somewhat familiar with it already because they've been engaging in conversation with someone. So the more you can do that, the more you'll reach the bystanders. And of course, you still may have resistance. The second thing is don't panic at the early stage when you launch, because you're likely to have an elevated level of resistance just because people go into shock. So don't panic on that one. It's not about you. It's going to settle down like a big storm that eventually the storm goes away and you'll see where it settles. And that's when you take the action of going after those bystanders and learn. There's a lot of things to constantly be stimulated by. For example, the article you mentioned earlier, Winning Against Resistance to Change, I learned a long time ago that anything I've written that's more than a year old has no marketing value and no commercial value unless I give it away for free. So on my website at www.weissinternational.ca, I've actually put on 60 of my articles, chapters of each of my 7 books, so that people are able to learn and read. There are many sources. That article, Winning Against Resistance to Change, is there, and there are others. And one about complexity, decision-making for complex situations is there. They're all free downloads. Learn from those. Learn from wherever you can and keep your mind growing. Don't get fixed in the world of change. It's a complex space and it always is going to be dependent upon the nature of what's happening around you. And you need to increase your tool chest of options and possibilities to know how to apply the right thing to the right context.
It's a complex thing, and I don't think it's going to be anything different because we deal with the human side. And we're going to put all the information on the podcast content, David. It's been a pleasure having you in my podcast, The Inner Game of Change. I like what you're doing. In fact, the principle of this podcast is knowledge is useless unless you share it. And that's why,
absolutely.
And that's why I do what I do on a daily basis. I am grateful for your time, David. I hope I can get you back in the future at some stage and we dive deeper into one of your other topics. Until next time, stay well and stay safe.
All the best to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode valuable, remember to subscribe to stay updated on upcoming episodes. Your support is truly appreciated. And by sharing this podcast with your colleagues, friends, and fellow change practitioners, it can help me reach even more individuals and professionals who can benefit from these discussions. Remember, and in my opinion, change is an enduring force, and you will only have a measure of certainty and control when you embrace it. Until next time, thank you for being part of the Inner Game of Change community. I am Ali Jama, and this is the Inner Game of Change podcast.
It was fine. It was a pleasure chatting with you. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I'll